Well, well, what has the cat dragged in today? It's a tutorial on goals. Continuing on with our Plinko game, we're going to get our goals working today. So the current state of things is that we have the ability to move left and right, limited so that it will not go past or into the sides. And when we click with the mouse or whatever happens to be bound to fire one, the ball is launched with a random force and torque applied to it. Once it gets to the bottom, it hits the reset trigger and the ball gets reset back up to the top. So we need to get the goals put in and a little bit of game logic to monitor, a little bit of logic to monitor the game state, I should say. And then we'll be good to go. We'll be done with our Plinko game. Now let's take a moment to think about how we're going to handle the logic for the goals. Where should I put the logic? This is a question you will frequently face in game development. Doesn't matter your engine. Of where should logic be? This is a simple enough project that I could literally put every single last scrap of logic on the ball itself. It might get a bit messy, and it's certainly not something that I would recommend, but I could do it. But if you think about more complex games, let's go all out on this. Let's think about something like Skyrim, Grand Theft Auto 5, Red Dead Redemption 2, Cyberpunk 2077, these massive games that have massive numbers of interactions. Where you put your logic becomes a lot more important. Again, obviously not that important for this project because it's so simple, but we want to start that thinking process. Now, there is no magic formula for determining where logic should be. In general, I like to see how if I can phrase something in a way that keeps all of the logic, all the interactions on the same object. So, for example, when it comes to the ball hitting the reset, I could phrase it as when the reset is hit by the ball gets reset, or the ball gets reset back up to the top. I don't like the way that's phrased because here, the way that is worded, the reset bar is acting on the ball. Now, if I phrase that differently, when the ball hits the reset bar, the ball resets itself to the top of the screen. Now I can keep that wording all on the ball. The ball hits, the ball changes its state. Therefore, that is logic that I want to have on the ball. Could I have put the reset logic on the reset trigger here? Yes. Would have it worked just as fine? Yes. But to me, at least, it makes more sense to have that logic on the ball. I can apply that same process to the goals here. Could I put the logic on the ball? Yes. But now I'm going to say the ball hits the goal and the goal changes state. It's like, nope, I've got the front and the back are mismatched. I've got the ball changing the goal. Can I rephrase this to use just the goal? The goal is hit by the ball and the goal changes material. There we go. I have phrased it in such a way that I keep all the actions within this object. You can't always do that. And sometimes that's not even desirable. There's no hard, fast rules here. But that's at least my starting point for trying to determine where to put my logic. So I'm going to put the logic for the goal on the goal. That makes the most sense to me in this scenario. Now, rather than embedding the flowchart, and I keep saying flowchart, it's a flow graph, not a flow chart. Ignore my inability to say it correctly. Now, normally when we're putting flow machines on, we have been embedding the flow graph onto the object. This is good when you know it's a one-off object that you're not going to have to use in different scenes. The ball, for example, we've only got the one scene. There's not more than one ball. So it makes sense to have the flow machine, the flow graph, embedded in the ball. But does that make sense for the goal? No, not really. Now, I could embed it. So I've got one goal here. I could embed the flow graph, create it, duplicate this goal out, and I would have 5 copies of the flow graph. Duplicate it out, and so on and so forth. All of these would have the appropriate logic on them. But here's the issue. What happens if I want to make a change? Now I'd have to go and make the change to this one, and to this one, and to this one, and to this one, and to this one. I'm asking for bugs. Remember in a previous video, I pointed out that just simply overlooking a single value on my ball, not changing the mass to 10, caused irregular behavior compared to what my practice sessions told me I should expect from it. And now I'm going to go through and make the same change 5 times across 5 different objects and pray I don't make a mistake. What if I have 10, 15, 20 objects that I need to make this change to? Not good. And that is why we are going to use a macro. A bolt macro is a flow graph that exists as an asset. So I'm in my project settings here, or my project folder. Sorry, project folder, not settings. And I'm going to right-click, create, bolt, flow macro. I'm going to call this macro goal logic. Now what happens is this flow graph exists as an asset. So what I can do is I can create the graph, apply it, and then apply it to as many different objects as I want. And if I need to go back and make a change, I don't have to change each individual object. I just come back here to the macro and change the macro. It makes a lot more sense. So that is why we're doing it as a macro. There is another use for macros, but we'll get to that in the next tutorial sequence. All right, that is enough jibber jabber from me. Let's actually get this macro created. So I'm going to go to Edit Graph, switch to full screen. Now notice a macro doesn't start off with anything here. So I'm going to need to put in everything. Not really that big of a deal. It's just, we're not being tossed our start and our update. Which in this case is good because I don't need those. If you think about it, what does the goal need to do? The goal only needs to do something when something touches it. In other words, on an on-trigger enter message. That's all we need to know about. So I'm going to add on an on-trigger enter event. Now, what do I need to do? Well, I want to change materials. And I'm also going to want to update a score counter, and I'm only going to want to do this once. So actually we have a couple of other things that we need to set up. And you'll find this frequently as you're working on things. You're like, okay, yeah, I need a macro. Okay, great. It's going to be on trigger enter. What do I need to? Oh, right. Okay. I need X, Y, and Z, and I can't get those set up here. Oops. Okay. So we're going to have to go out and do something else. So I'm going to minimize that out. Let's deal with our materials first. What I want is I want my goals initially to be a transparent green. And then once they're hit, they will change to a transparent blue. So I'm going to switch over to my materials folder here, where we have our backdrop material. And I am going to create a new material. So right-click, create. There we are, sort of in the middle, material. I'm going to call it a green goal. And this time I'm going to leave the shader at standard, but I am going to change the rendering mode because I want this to be transparent. So I'm going to change the render mode to transparent. And then for the color value, which is albedo, I want to leave this blank. I don't want to add a texture onto this, but I'm going to change the color value. Change it to a nice bright green. And I'm going to change the alpha value here to 128. So basically 50% transparency. And if I apply that, you can see that we can see through it now. It's got a transparent quality to it. I'm going to duplicate it, do a Control D. And I'm going to update the color. Obviously, I'm going to want the color to be blue. So when the goal is hit, it's going to change to this. Now, I also need to think about how am I going to keep track of when have I won? My win condition for this is going to be each of the 5 goals have been hit at least once. I don't care if I hit the same goal 5 times. I want to hit each goal at least once. Now, there can be a lot of different ways that you can approach this. My general philosophy is don't try and get too clever, because the player isn't going to care. No player is ever going to care how clever your solution is under the hood. All they're going to care about is, does it work, and does it work well? So at the end of the day, if I just have a counter variable that gets increased by 1 each time a goal gets hit, that will work. Now, I need this variable to be visible across multiple objects. So what I'm going to need is a scene variable. So I've gone to the variables window, which, remember, you can go to window variables to open that up. I've gone to the variables window, also accessible if you're looking at a graph and you are in full screen. And I have created a variable called hit count that is an integer, default value of 0. Now with this scene variable here, I can access that in my goal. So let's go back to our macro. And get this dealt with. Now, I know I'm going to need a graph variable here to track whether or not this specific goal has been hit. So I'm going to create a variable called isHit that I'm going to set as a Boolean, initially unchecked, so false. IsHit is false. And I'm going to immediately branch off of that. So I am going to branch on is hit. Now, if is hit is true, I'm not going to do anything. I've already been hit. If is hit is false, then I'll do something. And I could reverse that. I could call it can score and true false. It doesn't really matter. Just whatever the logic makes the most sense for you. And in this case, this is the way my mind went to this problem. So, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my graph variable of is hit to true. Sorry. Because I don't want to do this again. Next, I am going to need to set a new material, and this is where we get into a little bit of an interesting problem. Yep. And I'm typing that in wrong. There it is. Mesh renderer material set. How do I add in the material? Because this is an asset. It's not in the scene. So I can't directly link something in here. I mean, I suppose I could directly link in a material. You know, I could directly link in the blue goal material here. But what if I don't want that? What if I want the user to define that? Maybe I've got different levels, and on some levels it's going to be a blue tint. On some levels it's going to be a red tint for whatever reason. Who knows? So I'm going to want to use a variable. But it can't be a graph variable, because graph variables aren't visible in the inspector. So I'm going to want to use an object variable, but you notice object is grayed out here because I'm working on a macro. I'm not attached to an object, but I can still reference an object variable. So I'm going to come down here to variables, and I'm going to come down here to object. I'm going to say get object variable. Now, obviously, the drop down is not going to work, but I can still type in a string here. Hit material. That's undefined right now. It has no definition. That variable does not exist for the macro yet. So there we go. Assuming that I remember to set my object up correctly, this will work. There's one last thing I need to do. I need to increase that hit count. So I need to set another variable. This time it's going to be a scene variable. And again, this is an asset. It's not in a scene, so the little drop down here doesn't work. But I can still type it in. And what am I going to set that to? Well, I am going to set it to... nope, that's not what I want to click on. There we go. Hit count. So I'm going to get hit count, I'm going to add 1 to it, and I'm going to set that value back to hit count. And that's all the logic I need for my macro. Now let's apply it and make sure that we set up this material object variable. Switch out of full screen here for a moment. I am going to go back to my goal. And since I'm going to need a bunch of these and I want to keep track of them, I am going to create another container object. So I will create a new empty game object. Call that goals. Drag it in there. Okay, so good to go for duplication. So I'm going to come down to my flow machine component, which I added on earlier. Kind of snuck that in there. And I'm going to change the source from embed to macro. It's going to warn me that by doing this, I will obliterate any embedded graph that happens to exist, which is fine. And I will attach my macro. You could also use the selector. Of course, mine's different because I have my practice session still in here. And there we go. Now you can still edit graph from here. It will still let you edit the graph, but this is editing the macro. Now I'm going to need a new object level variable here. So I'm going to come over here to variables. Hit material. I'm going to add that in. And I need this to be of type material. And I'm going to have to type that one in to search through all of my possible types, because that's not going to be one of the default ones it shows me. And I will hook in my blue goal material. Now we should be ready to go for testing. Now, to make testing a little bit easier, again, this is one of the nice things for having things grouped up like this. I am going to disable my pegs collection. So that way I can just drop the ball, hopefully, straight down into the goal. Seriously? Still took me 2 tries. And it worked. It hit the trigger, changed it blue. And if I go and look at my variables, hit count as 1. Let's do this again. Randomness, you are my foe. And okay, I've hit the trigger multiple times now, but my hit count is still at 1. So it is working as expected. Let's get these goals duplicated out. So Control D. Get back over there. Control D. And you will be -12. There we go. Control D. You will be 6. Control D. And you will be 12. Again, I'm going to leave my pegs disabled to make testing just a bit easier on myself. And I should be able okay, yep, they're all turning blue as expected. And if I go look at my variables and scene, hit count is 5. Everything is working as expected. There's just one last thing left then for us to do. Let's turn our pegs back on. And that is to put in our win condition. And we'll deal with that in a separate video, because while we won't be dealing much with the UI elements that come with Unity, it's still a new topic, and I want to take my time to introduce it. And this video is getting a little bit long in the tooth. So we will complete the victory screen in the next video. And you can see now why, when I was wanting to test, I disabled all my pegs just to make it a little bit easier. And there we go. We are almost done. One last video, and that is it. And as always, if you found this video to be useful or entertaining, a thumbs up would be appreciated. And if unfortunately not, well, the thumbs down button is right next to it. I will see you in the next video.